8.1 is a discussion of the school start times. Dr. Smyser.
Scott Nielsen is approaching the podium. The bench. Approach the bench. We actually are excited to have a public conversation about what we are learning so far in this process about our exploration of changing school start times. So I will let Mr. Nielsen get fired up over there.
You guys still have clicker around? All right, well, I'll get started before I get the clicker then. We'll go old school without a clicker. All right, good evening, President Fev and Board of Education members. It's my pleasure to talk a little bit tonight about what we have been doing in regards to this start time conversation. We have a bunch of slides that I think you've had a chance to see. I'm going to move through those relatively quickly, hopefully get to a place where we can have a little conversation and talk next steps. As you know, PSD is looking at the opportunity to shift our start times a little bit. Thank you. I don't know why I'm more comfortable with that in my hand, but I just am. It's like my security blanket. I can't because I'm tied to the microphone. But as we think about this, it's important to remember that research guides us in many of the things that we tackle. And in this case, the AMA recommends a start time for high schools, secondary students of 8:30 or later. It's also important to remember as we think about our current start times that our secondary schools start currently between 7:25 and 8:15. We also recognize that start times, whatever our decision, will be challenging for some and positive for others. As with many decisions that we make, they will have an impact on the community. Our community involvement is important as we go through that process. When we recognize it's going to have an impact, it is important to engage our community. And so our first step was to dig in with a survey and get some initial feedback. And we're pleased with the results that we've seen and look forward to sharing those through this presentation. We sent the survey out to close to 60,000 people. Our response rate was awesome, 17.4%, much higher than any other survey we send out. 3 times as high as most our returns on surveys. So I think that's positive and gives us good information, a good chance to see what our constituents think. The goals were really to identify what some of our community members valued. And so we sent our survey out to 8 different constituent groups: our parents of elementary, middle, and high school, our high school students, our teachers at all 3 levels, and community members. And the responses were pretty solid from all of those. I would say if we were disappointed, it was probably with the community members that didn't have students in our schools. That would be the result. We wished we probably would have had a little more, and I think we can engage the community members as we go through the process. Of the 10,000 students, or 10,000 responses we had, 74% of them were parents or guardians, 13% were high school students, 9 were staff members, and as I said, just 1% were from the community. Of those who responded, when we think about the parents and guardians, 62% of the students, 62% of the parents reported their students didn't ride the bus. 58% of the parents that responded at the secondary level said their students didn't ride the bus, and 74% at the elementary level, so that's where the average for 62% came from. The high school students that took the survey, 77% of them did not ride the bus. And we juxtapose, we wanted to show you that, to show you as we think about the information we have internally that we look at twice a year, about 44% of our elementary students ride the bus, 52% of our middle school students, and 43% of our high school students. So that's just so you get a representative that a large percentage of who reported were not bus riders.
Scott,
Yeah.
just as a suggestion, you may want to mention for the public why you're talking about bus ridership. I mean, yeah, it was in the survey, but why is it relevant to the conversation? That's all.
Yeah, bus ridership will, I mean, it's important, it's an important leverage point as you think about how we make the decision, because it will, our buses play an important role in how we decide start times and how much flexibility we have in the start times we're able to move between, given the constraints of trying to negotiate elementary, middle, and high school start times. Of the respondents, this was interesting for our staff as we looked at the results. 85% of all respondents said a later start time was somewhat important or very important, and that's across all levels, all constituents. The importance it was very important, importance of a later start time by respondent group. This just gives you a sense of, as you look across the high school group, it was very important. You can see the high school and middle school group said it was very important. The elementary group said it was, they tended to say it was somewhat important, although both very important and somewhat important were high for the elementary group as well. High school students, like their parents, said that the high school start time, later start, was very important to them, and if it wasn't, it was somewhat important. It was, but if we go back one slide before, when we think 85% of all of the respondents, that, for me, I would say was a surprise. As you look at these, and I'm going to go through these quickly, the next 6 really just talk about the optimal start times. What you can see is the optimal start times were between 8 and 8:30. All 3 groups look almost identical in terms of believing that the start time between 8 and 8:30 is ideal. And so you can look at our high school start times, and in this graph you have what the parents said, what the students said, and what the staff said. When you go to the next 2, you have what the parents and the staff said. Again, they almost all agree. A little bit more energy at the elementary level to start at that 8 going 8 to 2:45. And then the next 3 graphs just are inverses. They're just exactly the opposite. They almost fill each other in. Then we get to the part where those that responded to the survey told us whether they were involved in extracurricular activities and athletics, to give us a sense of what were they saying. Of the high school students that reported, 49% said they were involved in extracurricular activities. 46% said they were involved in PSD athletics. Of the parents who reported for the high school students, 55 of the parents said that they're participating, or their students participate in athletics, and 42% of those parents said their kids participated in PSD extracurricular activities. The middle school parents reported that over half of their students participated in athletics, and over 55, or about 55%, participated in non-PSD athletics, which I think is another important factor for us. Staff, I think this is another thing for us as we go through this to consider, how do we mitigate, because what we learned in this survey is that a tremendous amount of our staff who responded also supports stuff outside of the school day, whether it's extracurricular activities or athletics. 325 of the reporting staff members said they help with PSD activities. 164 support things for students or other organizations outside of the PSD world. And in athletics, 195 of those staff members said they support PSD athletics, while 182 said they do other athletics outside of PSD. So we recognize, and I think board members, you know that by seeing the number of our teachers who are doing things outside the school day, the tremendous amount of energy that they give our community outside of just what they do in terms of teaching or supporting the classroom. This was one that stuck out to us, I think, as we looked at it, that of the reporting students, 26% of them said they're somewhat responsible for childcare as they leave school. So something for us to consider. How does that affect what we are thinking about? The importance of secondary student and early dismissal. Those who the parents reported that for 27% it was important, and that coincides pretty well with what the students said too. 47% of those who responded said child care wasn't important to them, and then 26% of the parents who reported said there's no basis. Likely only child or their other students are out, or they just don't need support like that. The elementary parents reported that there was need for child care before school and after school, both below 30%. The before school is under 20% of those who reported. Again, we go back to what we talked about earlier, that the preference for later start. The elementary level, 32% of those who responded said that they preferred looking at a later start. Ironically, and I think supportively of the decision or looking at it, more than that responded by saying we believe elementary should be earlier. So there was that information as you got a chance to dig into the report. Many elementary parents believe that our elementary start times are too late. And then you get to the middle school and high school, which is the overwhelmingly supportive of looking at a later start. At the 85 for middle schools and 87% for the high school guardians. As we looked at some of the community member responses, what we did have was overwhelmingly supportive. 93% of those who responded were supportive, either thought it was very important or somewhat important to make this move. They believed the optimal time, just like the other respondents, was between 8 and 8:30, so they fell right in line with all the other information we had. The optimal start time and end times between 7:45 and 8:15 for elementary schools is what our community responded. And the unacceptable times were that early morning 7:30 start times or after 9 o'clock. A 2:15 dismissal or after 4 o'clock were what they felt like were unacceptable start times from the community's perspective. So as we get into points of view, I think that's where it was interesting to me. The data itself was great. It was interesting to get into the comments that were made, which, as you dug through it, there was a lot. Generally, there was support, though. I was surprised how across all levels, across all feedback, there was a great deal of support for making this move. Maybe surprised is the wrong word, but it was they agreed with each other a lot in what they said. So we tried to capture some of the themes that we heard. Generally, there was support for considering late start times at the secondary level across all the respondent groups. They shared throughout the themes that research shows that later start is good for secondary students. Therefore, PSD should implement it. And there were clearly people in there that were impatient for us to look at a 19 start, that there were clearly people who thought we should do it faster than that. There was observation in there that students do better. There were many observations that talked about students doing better when they see their students on the late start versus the regular start time at the high school currently. And many across all levels that talked about the elementary student being awake and ready to go earlier in the morning than the secondary student. So many families, elementary, middle, and high school, recognized that that was a common occurrence. For those positive points of view, we also had some that jumped out several times on the negative. One of the ones that was in there several times was a belief that if we move start times back, we're going to ultimately allow students to stay up later and go to bed later, thus not having any more sleep. So that was one that popped up multiple times. There's also the belief, you see this themes across education a lot, or people's beliefs around education, that we've got to get them ready for the business world, and the business world starts early, so let's start them early. So that one popped up a bunch. Unsafe for elementary to be out of dark. That's one we've heard each time you study it, you hear that one. Later start and end times will interfere too much with family time. You heard a lot of respecting that family time at the end of the day. That was a theme that you heard throughout many constituents. Students and staff have after-school jobs, so trying to be respectful of that ending time. Additional child care dedicated by different start times may be challenging and cost prohibitive for some of our families. That was a theme you heard. So those were some of the opposing points of view, if you will. I would say key findings for us, that considerations for us as we work on this going forward, that the ideal start time windows between 8 and 8:30 give us ample room to play around with, but even looking at multiple options, including a flip. Looking at the flip, we think we have enough flexibility in the information that we've been given to look at that option as a viable option as well. Ending times are a particular concern. So what's our flexibility as we look at the schedules, even in the duration of the day for high schools, to potentially look at a later start time and not necessarily have to make it congruent. If we move the start time an hour back, do we have to move the end time an hour back? Or is there flexibility within the day that we can be mindful of what's happening in the afternoon and not necessarily move an hour later or whatever it is, but what flexibility do we have? It was clear from the high school students specifically that they favor the later start time, but are worried about the end time. And I would be too if I was a student, because I'd be shrinking my day. So, but that was something that came up a lot. They're clearly thinking about maintaining time for homework, completion, extracurricular activities. How do all those things happen? Jobs and everything else they're doing. So that was, as you read the comments, that was certainly something they were thinking about as they responded. The impact of parent work schedules, family, are something we at least need to hear and listen to as we go through this process, because that will be an impact. People will have to change structures that they may have had in place for many years. And this shift, whatever the shift will be, likely will have some impact on structures and schedules that families have created. So as we go through this process, learning and educating to the benefits and opportunities, as we create some challenges for some families, and you heard that in the themes that we'll create some. The cost and logistics of child care, what do we do to help mitigate that? How do we make sure we have support? If it's base camp, how do we make sure we have base camp available for the times we may need it? Depending on what happens, you may end up with a lot of base camp after school and less that happens before and after school, if that is a way we move. So we have to make sure as we go through that whatever process that we're thinking through those in each of the scenarios, and that we make sure that research drives what we're doing for secondary. We've been asked in the survey, one of the questions was asked several times, and we've heard it from others in the community, is what research is out there around elementary school, and that we are mindful about the elementary students as well. Research right now is pretty available in terms of secondary. There's very little, I would say maybe very little is too much in terms of what research is out there for an early elementary start time. So being mindful of all the students as we go through whatever the decision process is. Some of the other considerations, making sure that we are thoughtful about a staggered start. Obviously, transportation, we're driven by a staggered start because we have limited amounts of buses. We don't have the flexibility to transport all our kids at the same time. So we'll have to build in staggered starts. But we also heard from several of our constituents that they have multiple people at different levels that they would like to be able to transport themselves as well, so they get their elementary student to school and then their middle, and in some cases even still high school students. So they have the flexibility. So that was apparent in the results. That we should think about our start and end time of staff. Given the constraints our staff have and their flexibility, their ability to work, that there is some energy around will we lose some of our staff that support us, but will we also make it harder if in fact we have staff members that are working more than one job? Do we make it harder for them to have that second job if that's what they need to do? We also saw conflicting support in the results, that there was some information that was supportive of let's do this, and if we incur some costs to do it, let's do it and do it right. And there were other sentiments that said, let's not spend money on it, let's spend money on the kids in their classrooms. If we're going to do this, let's figure out how to do it with no cost. Just as we saw going through there, we've had that conversation, I think, even our staff and the board already in terms of what's there, but it felt like there was information that allowed us to look at both options. And then as we think about our next steps, obviously we moved through this first scenario. We've now opened up the applications for the committee, and I will share with you that the interest in being on the committee is not widespread. We haven't had huge numbers of people who say they want to be a part of it from the staff or the community members. But we'll run a committee. We plan on having several scenarios that we'll be able to bring back and that we'll want to get information from the board for sure. And then we'll start that feedback in late summer, where we look to get information on all four if we come back with 4 scenarios. And then the community engagement that we run August and September, where we really have a chance to educate around whatever the scenarios are that we bring forward, to educate around the opportunities and make sure that the group understands through the survey we send out the importance of the positives behind each of the scenarios, pros and cons. And then, as we talked about before, bringing the information we have from our community engagement and the information we've created as a staff back to the board for decision-making in December to January of next year. Hopefully we'll get it in front of you in December so that we have a chance to discuss and talk about what next steps are for whatever the decision is to be implemented in the fall of 19. And with that, I would love to take some questions, and if there are questions that I can't answer, we've got some support staff on the other side of the room.
Thank you very much. All right, board members, I'll go with Rob first. All right.
So thanks for that report and for all the information you've gathered and for reading through all those bazillion comments that came in, because there were quite a lot of them. We've got all of them in the packet, I think, is what I understand.
You do.
And that's quite a task. So thank you for that. There are really 2 different things I want to touch on, and we can do it with a break in between if you want or whatever. And then there's a question at the end. But the first thing is that the statement on the next, consideration slide, I think it is, that says the ideal start time is between 8 and 8:30 and whatever the end times are associated with that. Yeah, the first thing, yeah. To the extent that that's based on the current survey, it seems to me that, well, to the extent it's based on the current survey and to the extent that the respondents on the current survey had varying degrees of education as to the reasons we're doing this and the research behind it, and varying concerns, as you've described here, in terms of childcare, in terms of extracurricular activities, and therefore varying assumptions about what might happen if we change the times more dramatically than this. It seems to me that if we can address those educational needs and perhaps address some of the concerns in ways that are satisfactory to some of those people who expressed concerns, there might be more flexibility in the start and end times than the ones you have on there. Because if those folks were more educated or knew that their concerns would be worked out in some way, they might support an earlier start time for some level, or a later start or a later end time for some level, or whatever. So I just want to be careful that we don't that we don't constrain ourselves too much.
Yeah, I would say if we think back to the reason for the survey was to give us a sandbox, and I think for us, as we looked at it, certainly for me, we've been given the go-ahead with what we have to look at lots of different options.
Okay.
We didn't, if we had the respondents that said no later than 8 o'clock for our high schools to start, it would have been hard to come back with an 8:45 start time if everybody said 8 o'clock was no later than that would be because it didn't work. The flexibility, when you look at even the information, 8 to 8:30 is where it landed. That's where everyone was happiest. But there's a lot of flexibility in there for us to look at scenarios, and if we end up at 8:45, because that's what works when we look at a scenario, yes, we're going to have to be able to talk to our constituents at that point and talk about why, but it's now our task to take this and build scenarios that
And that's-
work for all three. But I feel very comfortable, as I think the other people working on the committee with me, we feel like we have plenty of room to play around.
Okay, and that's fine. I just don't want the committee to sit down and say, you know, this is what we were given in the survey, and so we can only play in this exact sandbox,
Yeah.
because I think there's more flexibility than that. I'm not saying that means we should start high schools at 9:30 or something.
Right.
I'm not proposing that. I'm not
Right.
proposing anything in particular. I just want to have an open mind
Yeah.
with respect to those
No,
things.
we'll have to, because the fact that all of our constituents agreed that a great start time is between 8 and 8:30, we don't have the capacity to start all our schools between 8 and 8:30.
Okay, fine.
So we're going to have flexibility as we look at those things. Am I saying that fairly correctly, Matt?
Okay, and as we consider, and this is related to this same topic, and then we can do whatever you need to do. As the committee gets brought together, presumably they'll be given that guidance, but they'll, I assume, also be given the opportunity, or at least the pointers to the research and other materials associated with why we're considering this in the first place, so that they're pretty well educated on
Yeah, you bet.
on that, as well as the school bus challenges and the base camp challenges and this, that, and the other thing. You
Yeah,
know, I mean,
yeah,
absolutely.
that committee becomes resources for us, right? They
Excellent.
help
And as long as
do the work.
and as long as they're well educated on all the pieces, that's terrific. So I have
Okay.
something else, but you decide.
Let
which
me
one.
toss it over to Kathy and then Nate, it looks like.
Thank you. Did I get that on? Okay. We really appreciate, or at least I really appreciate, all the work that you guys have done to put this together. I'm excited that there's so much community support for this idea, and that we're going to be moving forward with it. I guess one of the things I wanted to remind people, you said we had a limited number of applicants for the committee. I believe the application deadline is tomorrow, and there is a link on the website. So folks who are watching this, I know there's a zillion people out there watching this because this is the prime time rated show.
Almost as many as the Olympics.
Yeah, totally. So please go online to psdschools.org, click on the link, and apply to be on the committee. Because you know what? If my kids were still in the PSD system, I would totally be all over this. It sounds like a great committee to be on.
And we may actually consider extending the deadline a bit. We'll see.
Okay, and in addition to that, I just wanted to remind people, and sort of the continuing theme for the evening, that we do need more bus drivers under the current scenario or the future scenario. So please go on to psdschools.org and apply to be a bus driver, because we provide all the training and we'll start you at any time. So just had to put out that plug. But thank you for all your work. This is really exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Kip.
All right,
Director
Nate?
Yes, I digress a little bit based on that last comment. When I drive students in a bus for a neighboring district, when I have to take them on a field trip and get 50 hours a week, I'm gonna tape them saying, "Thanks, Mr. Bryant," and I'll forward that along to you. But I'm glad we're getting more bus drivers here.
Conflict of interest.
Perhaps.
Buzzer's going.
Yeah. As far as the optimal dismissal times, can you give us an idea of what the range of the current dismissal times, how much they differ? Is it like half an hour, 45 minutes at the latest? I mean, What's an example of a current dismissal time for high school versus 3:50?
Yeah, our high schools think about an hour earlier than that. So
About an hour, okay. So-
10 to 3, quarter to 3.
Yeah, okay.
We have
All right.
middle schools that get out as early as 2:30,
Okay,
2:35.
So
One
can-
middle school that gets out at 3:15.
okay. All right, that's fine. And I think we certainly will, but I'd like to highlight that we need to investigate childcare options for those that are going to need it. And I'm also interested in, of course, there will be costs and logistics for families and students, but I'm wondering what the direct costs will be to the district. So that'll be something that the committee will consider.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and then outside, I mean, one of the costs could be transportation, but you're right, there could be others as well.
Sure,
And those
okay.
are, when you think about, we'll have to come up with challenges and opportunities or pros and cons. I mean, I think we have to
Sure.
look at those things. We go through a cost, what's the cost benefit to them?
And then, of course, we need to look at the impact on the current employees and especially school employees. But I would ask Director Bryant to opine on the impact on bus drivers. I can't imagine that it's going to be all that great, but I heard some whining down south because they're going to go to it starting this fall, and I thought, how's it going to impact a bus driver's life that much?
Yeah.
I can't answer how it's going to affect bus drivers, Matt. After you answer now, I'll be able to.
I think across the state, we're seeing this as a trend that, some districts have already done it, some districts are looking at doing it like we have, some have already planned next year to do it, as I think you're alluding to. There's so many different ways that districts are approaching this subject that it's hard for me right now to say what the impact could be to our bus drivers. Some of the things I hear around the state is that the routes are running so late that they're running into problems getting to their second job in the afternoons, where they need to be at work at 5, and now the routes are not over till 5. So will their employer let them get there at 6 or 5:30 or whatever the case may be? So there may be instances like that, and I think you're addressing that with the survey as far as the concerns with staff, trying to get to second jobs. So I hope that helps, but it's probably
It
not
does. Yeah,
the
thank
exact
you.
answer.
Appreciate it.
Okay, Carolyn?
And I noticed in the survey results and in one of the slides that you showed that that the elementary parents were more supportive of an earlier start time for their kids. What do you think is driving that, the 39% of parents supporting earlier start times for their elementary children?
Well, I think when you looked at the comments, they often talked about it, right? Their kids are up early. There were several that talked about their kids are up way earlier than their secondary students, and they end up taking the secondary students to school, and they still have their elementary students at home. So I think they recognize, I happen to live in a household I have a 4th grader and a 10th grader. And it's very clear to me every single day which one is up and ready to go and which one's not. And so I can sympathize, so I would have been one of those parents that would have said, my daughter is way more ready for school at 8 o'clock than my son is. And I think we saw that. The comments in there, I also think there was the little bit of work to educate in even this survey. And so there was a lot of recognition in the elementary parents of what the research is saying. So was that support they've got here? They've done it themselves, they've seen articles, but there was a lot of education in our elementary parent survey responses in terms of they understood that the high school starting later makes sense, but you also recognize that the elementary students are just, they're firing earlier in the morning, ready to go.
Okay, Kristen, you want to?
Yeah, and I can just add to that when my kids went going to elementary school, it was a 9 o'clock start time, and that was basically 2 hours of entertaining them before school was ready. So, yeah, so earlier start time would be great for elementary too, than the 9 o'clock. And thank you so much for all of this work. It looks great. I'm excited to see that that 85% is just that's phenomenal that people are understanding this already. The one thing I do want to make sure that we do as a whole is let the rest of the community know that we're doing this, whatever we end up with, so that any after-school activity, anything like that, they understand what those times would look like and what after-school care and what after-school activities and sports and that sort of thing would look like from a non-school perspective, so that they can prepare for that in a timely manner. So that's all I would ask for that too.
Yeah, I guess I would say that's one of the things I appreciate about not racing to do this quickly. I think we can partner with our community around how we do it and do it well. And often we could do it fast and end up doing it poorly because you don't have time to do all those things. I think that's a great point.
Okay, Rob, do you want to jump in next?
Yeah. I have three things now. So the first one is that I know there has been some, I don't know whether it's gone as far as discussion, but certainly some thoughts that I've heard voiced around alternate schedules for high school, like evening, for example, kind of stuff. And so I don't know whether, that's probably not for the majority of our kids or anything like that, but to the extent that we offer flexible arrangements for high school, that may or may not fit into this as well. And similarly, I know that more kids are interested in hybrid kind of arrangements. I know we have Pooter Global who's doing that as a matter of course, but to the extent that we're allowing kids to do more things online to fulfill their requirements, that may or may not provide some flexibility as well. And so I would, while all of those initiatives I'm sure aren't cooked at the same time as this, and I'm not suggesting we just stop this thing and wait for those things to be figured out. To the extent that they are being considered and they might impact opportunities for students in a way that affects how comfortable they are with this, let's think about that. That's all I'm saying, so.
Yeah,
Rob, that makes sense?
It totally makes sense, and I think you have 4 comprehensive high schools right now that are dabbling or trying to figure out how to do that. At least one that tried an evening class this semester.
Yeah.
Didn't have the interest, but was going to
really?
pursue it going
Okay.
forward.
All right.
I think those, I would say this, if we look back 3 years from now, we should see much more flexibility in how we use the buildings for the day.
Yeah.
In terms of, and it may be that the classes aren't even happening in the buildings, but that you're right, how do we provide options for kids and not having it be 8:30 to 3:30 or 9 to 4 is the only option. That's not the world we live in anymore, so we've got to figure out.
Right, and that
process.
just might
Great.
affect some
Yep.
support for this or not, or whatever. So you want to, okay, so the second thing is, as was alluded to, there are other folks who are doing this or who have done it. For example, Cherry Creek started this year, I think. Thompson's starting next year, and I suspect we know there are others around the country for sure.
Yep.
I'm sorry?
Well,
Weld started last year. So there are opportunities to learn from folks in Colorado and across the country about how to deal with some of these challenges.
Yep.
And I'm hoping that we're going to reach out quite explicitly to those folks and learn from what they've done. Is that something that I should
Yes.
expect?
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
good.
much easier to learn from the mistakes others make than to make them yourselves.
Exactly.
So, yes, we plan. And those that we've reached out to this point have been super gracious, so.
Okay, that's terrific. I really appreciate that. You want to? One more. Okay, well, I only have one more, and that's really a procedural thing, and that is on the last slide, it says that in December, the Board of Education makes determination regarding changes. Is that a statement that the Board of Education is going to vote on this thing? Or is it in the superintendent's domain, or how are we making it? I think we need to make a decision sooner rather than later about who's making the decision so that there's no confusion later on. That's my input.
I'm listening to the superintendent in my right ear almost hinting that she...
I can talk louder if you want.
to drown it out. No, I'm sensing it's kind of a however you'd rather see it. You know, if the board wants to sit here together and make that decision once we see all the parameters, and maybe that would just be appropriate in this case. So I mean, it was really a board initiative, in my opinion. So, what would you guys think? So.
On that score, I think high anxiety about who makes the decision at this point is a little premature. I think maybe by sometime a little bit into the fall semester is soon enough, but there may be some other considerations in that. My other point was, I apologize for minimizing the concern about how this was going to impact bus drivers. In that case, there was anxiety because the change is 4 months away. So in this case, we have the luxury of 18 months of anxiety. But that gives us more time to try to work things out. So.
Yeah, so I guess my request for making a decision about who makes a decision is so that there is. So let me paint the other scenario. If we get to based on what I've heard, I'm assuming we're all going to be singing Kumbaya together on this thing, but that's an assumption at this point. And if that assumption turns out to be invalid, I don't want to be in a position later on where, for example, the board decides that it wants to make the decision because it doesn't like the way the administration is going with this thing. So I think it'd be just better if we decide who's going to decide now when we don't actually know for sure what the answer is, and we can then all be comfortable with whatever that is, whatever that turns out to be. Now, if you want my opinion is the board ought to make the decision on this because it has the broad community impact, and to some degree it was at least some board members' initiative to try to push this forward. But I'm okay with it either way. I just think it's better to know sooner rather than later. That's my opinion.
Kathy, you want to jump in?
I think if it's a board decision, the superintendent's going to weigh in, and I think if it's a superintendent decision, the board is going to weigh in. I guess I just don't see that we're going to have huge issues there. If people feel like they want to decide, that's fine, but I guess I really don't foresee this being a potentially difficult issue for us.
Okay, and if I may, I'll jump in, and it looks like we have other comments. I think if there was a way to ask how anxious is the board, that's what I would ask. You know, but the moment I sense that there's anxiety, as the term you were using, I would argue that's an indication. In this case, maybe we just acknowledge that, and you know, to your point, maybe it's a board kind of input on certain items or a board decision, and the superintendent weighs in. But that would be my humble opinion on that. So I had two other hands. Was that Carolyn and Nate?
I was just going to say, if there's broad consensus across the board about what should be done, I think that would work really good, Kathy. But I think what happens if the board's split, you know? What if the superintendent says, yes, we should do this, and 4 board members say no, and 3 say yes? I mean, I can see why it could get could get confusing. I think if the board is split, or if the board doesn't agree with the superintendent, you know, it could get kind of funny. I think I don't know that it will, but it could. I think I'm sensing a lot of consensus here. But what if we get to the end and there's a money issue?
And Nate?
Paraphrasing the Coen brothers and Walter Supchak, calmer than you are, dude, calmer than you are. I don't see how this is going to work if the board and the superintendent don't come to a consensus. I mean, if we have a split and we don't do it, it's going to be out there, and we're going to have to come to a consensus sooner or later. So a split means maybe we don't do it, but if we do it on a split vote, it just seems to me that it's not really going to work exactly well if we don't have a consensus. Like Kathy said, what she said.
I was just saying that seems like a good point. I think too, the devil's going to be, or the angel is going to be in what we find out and how we design options and what we think we can afford, because what you're going to see is us bringing options to you and actual recommendations like, well, if we're going to do this, here's what it would cost, because money's going to come into it. We're going to, the kind of money that it would be to buy buses is going to involve you. You are going to have to, there are going to be dollar amounts that are big enough to involve the board. And then it's just likely that we're going to have done a lot of work together about scenarios, and we either arrive at a place where we say, okay, I think we've got this figured out, this is the best we're going to be able to do. I don't think any of us imagine we have the resources to do it the way everyone would like, but you are going to have to feel comfortable that it's close enough to what you wanted, but at the same time close enough for our community. And that is what I feel my job is to make sure we're getting touch points with the community all along the way, so that we're bringing you something that we think is what our community wants, or close anyway.
Okay, I'll go with Rob and then Nate.
Yeah, so, sorry. No.
Well, let's finish that. And then
Yeah, so I just have one more, I'm just going to say one more thing, and then, one more comment anyway, and then I'll let it be, and we can decide, then I can have my head chopped. So again, based on where we sit now, I think I'd be very surprised if we don't go forward with some change. I could be very surprised, but I could imagine, as I think Superintendent Smizer was alluding to, that the devil or the angel is in the details, and the superintendent, for example, might recommend one scenario, and the board members might think of a different scenario, and I don't know how. And so, again, there's who makes the decision question. And frankly, to be honest with you, and I think you all know this, I'm just trying to avoid situations we've had in the past where there's been some confusion about who makes the decision. And that was that conversation happened around after all the information was on the table and people were forming their opinions about, should we do this or that or the other thing, right? And I was just saying that I thought it would be better to be clearer up front before those opinions are formed in concrete. But I'm open to it. I'm just trying to avoid problems. That's
how
all.
about this? And to tell you where I sit, I think in this question about ends and means, it's somewhat clear in my mind that there is heavy board involvement, as maybe Kathy might put it. However the end decision comes, there's heavy board involvement. What if Susan and Dr. Smizer and I just pay attention and look for key decision points, and if we see something that needs to be decided as a board or brought up and voted on, we'll do that. So as we're going through, we'll just pay attention. You guys can point those things out to us, and we can kind of make those decisions. I think there's going to be a way that we're going to get through this that will. I agree. There are going to be some details that people are going to possibly disagree on, and we'll kind of look for those, and we'll find a way through them. But I also agree that by being aware of it ahead of time, we have a real opportunity to work through it. So you guys work with us, and I think we'll get there. So, okay. I think Carolyn had a comment or question. No, was it Nate then? Okay, sorry. And Susan. Okay. Susan wanted, she has not had a chance yet.
I know. Yeah, I'm just, I had a question about athletics, and I don't know quite how to formulate the question, but I can go back to an experience that we had when we went to, I think Rob and I went to a session, and I think it was Cherry Creek, and they were talking about how they've gone ahead and done the late start and so forth. And the impression that I got, this was my takeaway when asked about how the district would deal with being late to games or something like that because they're finishing later and maybe not in sync with the rest of the state in terms of competition times, it was like, well, they're just going to have to wait for us. And so I was just wondering, that's pretty much what he said, wasn't it? And I went, oh, okay. Yeah, and if you either want to play us or you don't. And so it was like, wow, that was what pretty much what I wanted to ask you. Where are we when it comes to that? But I had a second question too, and I wondered if we do try and make adjustments then for our athletics so that we can get our teams to competitions on time, is that going to impact the amount of school that the high school kids are going to miss?
I think it's an interesting question, one that was asked a lot in the responses. It depends. Right? I think when you think about what Cherry Creek said, they made a statement that in Cherry Creek, we're not going to start any games before whatever, I can't remember what time Harry said, 4:30. And how much control did he have traveling? But one of the things Cherry Creek has been pretty vocal about is the more people that move, the more influence we'll have over start times. But if all things stayed the same and we were supposed to be somewhere at such and such a time, it could mean that our athletes miss a little bit more time in school. There's a lot of play inside that, and I think even our middle school schedules from athletics, where they travel across town, right now they don't start till 3:30, so for many of our kids it's an hour after they're out of school. So it may be that middle school athletics doesn't change at all. They could still play close to 3:30 if the bus schedule works out, and they don't miss any more school, and they don't waste the hour that they're sitting at the other school waiting to play their game. So there might be efficiencies we find in the system as well, but it certainly depends on the outcomes. Those are things we're going to have to walk through and try to mitigate and figure it out.
Nate.
Well, I think it's important to have a deliberative process, so I'm glad we're doing this, and I don't think it's inevitable, and I don't think we need to do it just because some other people are doing it. But I've heard a lot of talk around the state that in 5 or 6 years, this may be very much more common than not. And that's not necessarily a reason to do it now, but at some point, we're going to be having serious conversations about whether we do it, even if we decide not to do it yet. So,
Very good. Board members, any other questions? Okay. And I'll just say that for this board, I mean, Kathy's been talking about this almost since I've been on the board, I think, and I was pretty longer than that.
A good 10 years
10
or more?
years, yeah.
20 years, maybe?
And I was probably really the latest to the game on this board, really, interestingly enough. But I feel like the work that's going on is really bringing me on board pretty quickly. So I really appreciate that. And I also wanted to say that reading the comments, which there were several thousands of them, that was really almost inspiring to see the involvement. But thank you very much for that presentation.